that you come here refreshed by worship and by breakfast for this next session, when we're going to have a conversation with three of our presidents again. And it's a great joy to welcome onto the platform Pastor Hugh Irukwu, who's president of the Pentecostal churches, the Reverend Canon Billy Kennedy, who is president for the New Churches, the Religious Society of Friends, and the Lutheran and German-speaking churches, and the Reverend Dr. Hugh Osgood, who is president for the Free Churches. You're very welcome, and we're very, very glad that you've been able to be with us today, because we do know how busy your schedules are, and that some of you have come from literally all over the world to be with us, so thank you very much indeed. The session is going to follow the same format as we did yesterday evening. So the presidents will have a conversation together, reflecting on the transforming power of Christ in their lives, in the churches and in the world, sharing some stories with us and some thoughts with us. And then we have three people who will come and join us on the stage to ask their questions to the presidents and to join in the conversation. And so, as you want to hear from the presidents and not from me, hand over straight away. And Billy, perhaps you could start the conversation off.
Thank you. I was thinking about this transforming presence of Christ, and in some ways the groups that we represent are a sign of the transforming presence of Christ, in that at times when the church was cold and dry.
Can you hold the microphone closer, please?
At times when the church was, I'm getting a boom here.
Turn the second microphone off.
Okay. Come on. So the transforming presence of Christ. In some ways, the church that we represent, free churches, Pentecostal churches, new churches, Quakers, all were birthed at times when maybe the church wasn't as all it should be, and God birthed in the hearts of men and women a passion for Christ and for His ways, and new churches began. And God is always in the work of bringing renewal to what is and birthing new things. And so I think this ongoing transforming work of Christ in His church is probably what we are testimony to, sitting here as the three of us.
That's an interesting point, isn't it, really? I tend to believe myself that the church was birthed as a movement for change right in the beginning. And I see, whatever church we're talking about, whether we're talking about the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, or the churches we represent, as churches that have been experiencing constant change. I know that there is a sense in what you say that some of the churches that we represent have come out of that sense of frustration at times. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'm not entirely sure, because I think God is constantly renewing His church. And whether it has to be with forming constant new denominations, although, I know God's a God of great variety, so it doesn't really bother me that we've got lots of denominations, as long as we all respect each other and love one another, as Jesus said. So I don't know what you think on that,
I thought about this theme this morning, and I thought just being here is an example of what Christ is doing in our lives, because just looking at this gathering and the representation from different groups who hitherto might have respected each other from a distance, but certainly wouldn't have been coming together to worship and pray with each other. And I think that's it's good to start with a positive, and that is an amazing positive. So churches together in England must be commended amongst some other groups that are doing this work of pulling us together. But then I think it must go to the next stage, the next level, where the responsibility cascades from the institutions or the organizations to the individuals. And that's where the rubber really hits the road. that's where we must all take on our responsibility. And it reminds me of that whole story in John's Gospel, the 4th chapter. That's a classic, where this woman who's in a bad state, wounded, battered, bruised, hopeless, has this encounter with Jesus. And her life is just completely transformed by that encounter with Jesus. And she goes on to kickstart a revival. And it kind of challenges me because that one woman who incidentally wasn't in the leadership, and that's a warning for us. The guys who were leading had gone off to look for food, and the revival took place in their absence, and that's a warning for all of us that if we don't take on our responsibility, if we don't do what we're supposed to do, this whole thing will bypass all of us and start in the most unlikely of places. So I feel, especially after listening to the archbishops, the cardinal yesterday, I felt a sense of responsibility for myself that you've got to do something about this. First, you've got to get that Christ in you to the extent that you can carry that Christ around and it can touch other people, change their lives, and then they can carry that Christ, and then there's a multiplier effect. So I feel very challenged just from last night to do more. Yeah.
I think about a friend of mine called Bob, who at 16 was a heroin addict. 20 years later, he had an encounter with Christ, turned his life upside down, felt God say, move back onto the estate he grew up on, move back onto the estate, began to feed those around him. In the last 10 years, he baptized over 100 people. Not an educated man, not a professional Christian, but just an ordinary person who had that life-transforming encounter with Jesus, as you say, like the woman at the well. And that inspires me to see what someone who just simply by allowing Christ to fill them, ooze through them, pour out of them, transforms his community. And others have come into that place of encounter as well. I'm sure you've all heard stories of people like that as well.
Yeah, I think it's good that we're coming back onto that sort of sense of personal encounter with Christ. I think that's really important. I think, the woman at the well is great, and Bob obviously, and we've probably got lots and lots of stories like that. And I just wonder sometimes whether, we come together at events like this and we celebrate the big picture, but it has to come down to the individual as well, doesn't it? Because in a sense, that's what the church is about. When Jesus said, you're the light of the world, there was a sense in which he was speaking corporately, but also it only works if each one of us individually has been illuminated by the grace of God. And so that personal encounter seems to be really, really important. I don't know about you guys, but I suppose for me, it was when I was at university, I'd sort of come up in a Christian home, but in my early teens, I sort of wobbled all over the place. Probably intellectually more than anything. I've been quite inspired by Albert Schweitzer, and I thought, this guy's got 3 doctorates. I can do theology, I can do medicine, and I can do music, and which was a bit of a big ask, really. So I started reading all the theology books in the library and got myself totally confused. And somewhere in the midst of it, just after I started at medical school, I had a real encounter with God. And that changed my life. And what was so interesting was that I was in an Anglican church at the time. I've got quite a background. I started in the Salvation Army, then I was in an Anglican church, and I preached around the Methodist church. I think that's why they made me Free Churches moderator. I've done a bit of everything at some point or other. But in that Anglican church, it was just amazing. We were on a very difficult area on the south coast, and we just saw so many young people come to Christ. And I believe that one of the interesting things that's happening right now is that I think more and more young people are having a personal encounter with Christ than many of us are aware of. I just think it's just incredible. We are seeing something happen amongst the young people in this nation. And it's extraordinary. When we started the whole sort of postmodern debate and said, look, let's forget the meta-narrative, I don't think people think like that. They want to know the big picture. They want to know the real story. So there's a real hunger in people's hearts, and I think it's just amazing what God is doing. And you know, I went on and did quite a lot of student ministry around campuses, particularly around the south of England, from Oxford and all the way down. And again, I just see so many students coming to Christ and having a personal encounter with the Lord. And I know that's part of the Archbishop of Canterbury's story, just as it's part of mine, that in those moments you have a life-changing experience. And I think that's really important too. I don't want to push it to the point where everyone starts sort of saying, have I had a proper life-changing experience? But it's just great, isn't it, that God wants to meet us individually as well as to meet us corporately. And I think that's something that means a lot to me.
I kind of keep coming back to that story of this woman at the well, because I think what Jesus did to her, Jesus expects us to do to those who meet us. He's sitting in heaven, so we are here to do that. And just the way that an encounter with Jesus pushes you to step out of your comfort zone, pushes you to break barriers that separate. So he reaches out to a woman, he shouldn't have been doing that. He reaches out to a Samaritan, he definitely shouldn't have been doing that. And I just feel that sense of responsibility. In a sense, I ask myself, so what exactly are you doing? Because part of the challenge for me, and I'm sure for some of us, is that you've been in this for a long time. You've relatively long time. You're involved in administration and leadership and planning strategies and all the many other things that come with what most of us here do in some capacity or the other. And there's a danger that the fire that was in you many years ago as a result of that encounter, there's a danger, a real danger, that fire can peter out. And that's the reality. So I think for me, it's periodically going back to check if you're still burning with that fire the way you were. And if you haven't got sidetracked, maybe like the disciples, thinking about the things they should think about. We are hungry, we need to eat, somebody needs to organize the food. Why don't all 12 of us go and buy the food? I wonder why one or two didn't just stay behind, but it tells a story. And so when the encounter takes place, they're not there. When the revival starts, they're not a part of it. So I think it's for me, this is very personal, especially from yesterday. I'm saying to myself, you just have to be careful to keep your focus on what is most important. And all the other things will add up. And in the middle of that, of course, is the woman, her heart and her desire for God, for Christ, her prayer, if you want to, the way he explained to her about this water that she would drink, she'd never get thirsty again, and she just desperately wanted that water. Give me that water, give me that water. And I think if we're going to see this transformation of our communities, I think we will have to take ourselves into a place of prayer like we have never prayed before. And I think that's the call to us as church people in church and church leaders, that nothing is going to happen until we get ourselves into a place of persevering, prevailing prayer, and just refuse to let God go until he does what he has promised us to do. And so, yeah, I found yesterday very challenging. I'm looking forward to the next stage.
You picked up some of that, Hugh, there's a sense of the encounter, but then there's the perseverance. And I think for me, it's both that encounter that transforms and then the ongoing transforming work that takes place in our lives. We were up in Lindisfarne last week, first time I've been up there, where Aden, the cradle of Christianity for England, they say, but I think they sent corpsmen first to evangelize the pagan Northumbrians, and came back saying, they're so stubborn, it's never going to work. But Aden said, I'm going to go and bring the love of Christ to these people, and came. and persevered over, I think, 16, 17 years, and then Cuthbert came along another 50 years later. It took time for that transforming work to outwork itself in the people. And we talk about the Methodist revival, but it was over a period of 100 years. And slow and steady and consistent, the work of Christ through his church, through people. Growth wasn't dramatic necessarily, but it was consistent. I think there's something about that, the encounter and the perseverance that Christ transforms, works through us immediately and in the long term as well. I think both are important for me.
It's interesting listening to that, because we're still with the sort of big picture, which you're saying, like the transformation of the Methodist revivals from bread over time, and that's true for what happened with the Salvation Army and so many other things that, you know, particularly you said that we do represent in many ways. But also we're coming back to the individual, just how easy it is for leaders to get detached. And I think that sense of needing to be constantly engaged is something that's really important for us. And to try and work out how to do that. And I think one of the things that really fascinates me about CTE is that obviously we've got the presidents and we meet together, which is great. But then most of what happens within CTE is right down at a grassroots level. And it's trying to get the connection for me between what's happening at the grassroots level and what's happening at the top end, if you like. So I think the relationships amongst the 6 presidents are great. You know, we've got that strong relationship with each other and it works really well. And I think the relationships on the ground are great. I mean, I was very much involved in my local CTE group and helped get it going and all the rest of it. One of the things I found since I've been president is to try and keep that connection. So I've been trying to get round some of the local CTE groups, because when we're looking at the Theos report and looking at how CTE really is going to fulfill that benefit that comes out of the unity, it's going to be by mission on the ground, isn't it really? And in some ways that's going to be delivered by the local groups and how that works out. I mean, I'm quite committed to mass evangelism, and I know that a lot of people have responded, and I've seen people's lives transformed through that. But I'm also aware that, you know, some people respond in an anonymous situation, which is fine, but other people need that intimacy of contact, and so that's when the local comes in. So I think we've got a real challenge, and also saying that we see a lot happening with young people, but very often we let the young people get on with the young people. I was driving somewhere in Cambridgeshire, I think it was last Sunday, and I was listening to Vincent on the radio, and he was talking to the young people at the Catholic conference that's just been held, talking about having a need for Christ in the centre of your lives. And it was just great. I mean, he did make a comment about they were more exciting than the group that he'd just been with. But I think sometimes we find that, and if as leaders we could engage more, you know, right across the age range, that would make a huge, huge difference. I know Archbishop Angelos is still the great youth pioneer within the Coptic Church. And that kind of connectivity, I think, can be really helpful in keeping the fire alive as well. You know, meeting with people who've had a fresh encounter with the Lord refreshes our encounter with the Lord, and I think that's really important. You agree? And the other thing I was going to say is quite interesting, because obviously one of the reasons why the Free Churches exist, the Free Churches group, I mean, we're just coming up to 80 years old, and there was an existing group before that. But really, it came together as a Free Church Federal Council because there were certain things that we could do together. And one of them is putting chaplaincy into prisons and hospitals and further education. And one of the areas where I'm really seeing incredible transformation is in our prisons. I mean, people are encountering Christ in the most amazing way. And from what Agnew was saying as well, I try and make sure I preach in a prison at least once a year, because it makes sure that your communication vocabulary is a bit better. You know, someone once said that, you know, if all your words go over people's heads, it's not that you've got superior arrows, it's just that you're a bad shot. And so just, you know, to try and touch people's hearts in a prison is a good exercise. But God's so touched so many people's hearts already. I was in a prison the other week, and the worship was just absolutely incredible. And the attentiveness of the prisoners, they hadn't just come out of their cells to swap stuff that they shouldn't be swapping. They'd actually come out to meet with the Lord, and it's just exciting to see what's happening in some of those places.
Talking about prisons, you might have heard his story, but There was a speaker at our men's conference last week, and it was the most compelling story. A gentleman, pastor called Richard Taylor. He pastors in Wales, and he, at 10 years old, his family fell apart. He got onto drugs. By 15, he was in jail. He came out a year or two later and then went on a massive crime spree, robbing homes and selling drugs and all that stuff. And so he got back, taken back into the system, back into jail. And he's in prison, drugs are rife. He smokes cannabis, marijuana regularly. And one day he wants to smoke marijuana, and he can't find the paper to wrap the marijuana, the weed. And he finds a Gideon's Bible next to him, and he opens it and he tears out a page. It happens to be John 3. The page he tears out happens to the page, the third chapter, somewhere in there, for God so loved the world. So he smokes it, and the next day he wants to smoke again. He can't find any paper, so he opens the Bible. It falls open to John, the first chapter, and he starts reading. In the beginning was the Word, and he ends up reading the whole of John, and he gets inquisitive. Without Greek. John 1, 2, 4. And there's a lovely prison chaplain who his interest is now kind of stirred up. And cut long story short, he ends up giving his life to Christ. He pastors an amazing church in Wales. He oversees a church expression in Europe. And that for me is just what the transforming power of Christ can do. Like he said to me, you know Christ, I smoked him. So he's in me. But on a serious note, that's what the transforming power of Christ. And we have those stories. There are loads of stories like that where people have an encounter with Christ. And it's interesting that there is a lot that's happening in the prisons. It's probably one of the most important battlegrounds now for the souls of men.
Like to Thy Kingdom Come. Brian Heasley, who works for Thy Kingdom Come and is a good friend of mine, has developed a course of prayer in prison. So when you're praying in your parish church, leading up to Pentecost next year, there'll be people in prisons doing the same. And so it's amazing how that's crossed over into prisons, that people are praying Thy Kingdom Come during that time as well. So amazing.
Thank you for the conversation so far.